And how did you get out of being an economic hitman?
Well, so about halfway through, maybe 6 years as an economic hitman, I really got the knowledge that what we were doing was not what we said we were doing, that we were not helping most of the people in the countries where we were working. We were helping our own companies and a few wealthy families. I began to see that.
Mhm.
Once I saw it, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to see it. I grew up the son of a teacher in a boys' boarding school in New Hampshire. And my dad never made any money, really. His salary was very low. But we lived in a school house, a tiny house on the campus, and I ate in a dining room with 200 boys from the time I was 4 or 5. So I had a good house, I had food, but no cash, no money, and I was surrounded by very, very wealthy boys, many of them from Latin America, especially Venezuela in those days. It was a very wealthy country. Some Colombians, some from Argentina, um, and also a lot of boys from Park Avenue in New York and San Francisco, kids that had a great deal of money. And I grew up with these kids, and then I went to school for 4 years in high school with them, and I became very jealous of them. At Christmas vacations, they would go home, they would come back to school with stories about these incredible fiestas, these
Mhm.
parties they had been to, wonderful parties in New York and Buenos Aires and Paris and Caracas. And I spent the whole Christmas vacation throwing baskets in a school gymnasium that I had a key to, or hitting tennis balls against the wall, practicing tennis by myself. And so once I became chief economist at this consulting firm, suddenly I'm traveling first class around the world to all these places I've heard about before. I'm staying at the best hotels and eating at the finest restaurants and meeting with presidents and beautiful women. And I'd grown up in a boys' school, I was very shy with women, but suddenly I'm out there. And it was very attractive to me, that life. And I was making a very good salary. So once I knew that what I was doing was wrong, I didn't want to admit it. And there was a whole system in place to help me not admit it. So I would go and talk to psychologists at my company, or I talked to people at the World Bank. They said, no, you're doing the right thing. This is helping these countries. So there was a whole system set up to help convince me that what I was doing was the right thing. And I wanted to be convinced for a number of years. And then one day, after 10 years in this job, I took some time off, and I rented a sailboat in the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, and I anchored off a little island, St. John Island in the Virgin Islands. And I rowed the dinghy ashore, and I climbed this hill to an old sugarcane plantation that was in ruins, and sat up there with a can of beer and in this beautiful setting, beautiful flowers, bougainvillea and all kinds of flowers growing on these ruins, and looking out at the sun setting over the Caribbean. It was beautiful and idyllic, and I'm drinking this beer. But suddenly I saw that this plantation had been built on the bones of thousands of slaves.
Mhm.
And then it occurred to me that the whole hemisphere, Latin America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, North America, all of it's been built on the bones of millions of slaves.
Mhm.
And then I had to admit that I too was a slaver. I was enslaving people in debt in this imperialistic system. I wasn't actually putting people in chains. And in a way, what I was doing, I thought it was worse, because I didn't have to hear the screams
Mhm.
and see the dying slaves in the ships coming over from Africa, or hear the crack of whips on people's backs. I didn't have to do any of that. And yet what I was doing was still enslaving people in a very real way. It's a different way. It's not as physical, it's not as obvious, but I realized how subtle it was. And at that moment, I made the decision never to do it again. And a few days later, I went back to my headquarters and walked into my president's office and quit.
How were you able to write the two book of the economic hitman?
Well, after I quit,
Mhm.
I started to write, um, let's call it an expose, where I wanted to talk about what I'd done. And I started contacting other people who I knew who had jobs like mine, and the jackals, the ones that that go in and kill presidents.
Mhm.
I called them on the phone, and very soon after that, I got phone calls threatening to kill me, my daughter, who was an infant at the time. So these were voices, muffled voices that were the voices of jackals, people that I didn't know the particular individuals, but I recognized what they were saying. I knew that they were dangerous. I knew they weren't kidding. They could kill me. And so I was very torn what to do, to kill me, to kill my daughter. And it's about the same time I got taken out to dinner by the president of Stone and Webster, a big engineering consulting firm, may have been the biggest in the United States at the time, one of the biggest in the world. And it had been a competitor of my company, Charles T. May, and the company I just left. He took me out to dinner and he said, hey, you know, you have a great resume. You were chief economist. You had about 50 employees at our competitor, and now you're free, and we'd like to use your resume in our proposals. You don't have to do any work for us. Just let us use your resume. No, you don't have to do anything. And he said, you know, I'm prepared tomorrow to write you a check for $500,000, $500,000. And this was back in the 80s. $500,000 is a lot today, but it was a lot more then, maybe double that or so. So my life is being threatened and I'm being offered this amount of money. And he says to me, you don't have to do anything for us. Just don't write that book. Don't write that book. So my life's being threatened. My daughter's life is being threatened, and I'm being offered a bribe. It was totally legal to pay a person a consultant's retainer fee is totally legal. What would you do?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so I took the money. And took my daughter and myself out of harm's way. But instead of buying a lot of fancy cars and a big mansion or something, I put the money into going back to Ecuador, where I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer, going back out to the jungle, to the Amazon area where I'd worked with these indigenous people. And I went back out and I said, I know your forests are being threatened, and they're being threatened by things that I did. So I want to help turn this around. I want to help save your forests. And they said they appreciated that, but if I wanted to save the forest, I shouldn't come and try to change them because they weren't destroying the forest. They said, you know, you're the ones destroying the forest. Your oil companies, your mining companies, your beef, your cattle companies, your forest companies, your lumber companies. And most of all, it's your dream. It's the dream of the world where you live, this materialistic paradigm, this materialistic perception that you have to keep consuming and consuming. Go back and change the dream of your people. And so I did. I came back and I formed a nonprofit organization called Dream Change. And a few years later, there's a long story there, but a few years later, that also created another nonprofit, which you, Elizabeth, are very familiar with, the Pachamama Alliance, and to help save the forest, to employ lawyers and people to keep oil companies out of some of these very regions where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and also to change the dream of the world. And I know you're very involved in that, in the Dream Changer programs. And I think we're now in over 80 countries. I think we're in 87, very close to 90 countries where we're working, including the United States, of course, where we're working very hard to convince people that we need to move from a perception of the world that's created what I call a death economic system to one that is a life economic system. So, you know, that experience going back to those people that I've been a Peace Corps volunteer with had a profound, huge impact on me, and has had a big impact on many people in the world now, indirectly.